but he laments that ethics often only requires knowledge of, at most, how trolleys operate, we'll say. He says, but McIntyre says, right, he says, but we don't expect the students who do ethics to study sociology or psychology or anthropology. And then he says that without this knowledge, we're not aware of the varieties of human possibility, and we're in danger of being imprisoned by our own upbringing. And I think that's the value of doing cross-cultural work.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Owen Flanagan. He is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Duke University, and his work has focused on mind, ethics, moral psychology, cross-cultural philosophy, and other things. His books include, among others, Consciousness Reconsidered, The Really Hard Problem of Meaning in a Material World, The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized, The Geography of Morals, Varieties of Moral Responsibility, and his most recent book, which will be the topic of our discussion today, How to Do Things with Emotions, The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures. He also has a wide variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Owen.
Pleasure to be here, Troy. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So I got a chance to read the book, and it was really great read. I like the writing style and a lot of the points brought up that I thought were very interesting. And in this book, you explore and develop your thought on the nature of emotions, in particular anger and shame, and how they vary and are used across cultures, and how we might or should use them. But before getting to some of the details, what would you say is the primary intended audience for this book? I mean, ideally, it seems to me a book of this sort should be fairly accessible to the general audience without being too basic or uninteresting to philosophers or psychologists. Is this something you had in mind, or what would you think about that?
Thank you for asking that, Troy. Well, it was when I began my career, when I was about your age, my first teaching position, I was having trouble writing, and one of my colleagues, Ken Winkler, who's at Yale now, he said to me, you're a good teacher, write like you teach. So actually, right from the beginning, that helped me a lot. I always thank Ken. He never remembers saying that to me, but I thank him a lot for helping me sort of find a way to write. That said, it's the dream of every philosopher to write something that's accessible to a wide intellectual audience. I do try to speak in an idiom that is accessible that way. And sometimes I succeed and sometimes I don't. But I do think of, I do always think of accessibility and sort of a general audience when I try to write. That said, I'm aware of some people who just are really gifted at it. And, people like Dan Dennett, Tom Nagel, there are just some philosophers who just really know how to write for a popular audience. And Maisha Cherry, who's someone who's young philosopher who's working on anger and other emotions now. She's also a fine writer. Amiya Srinivasan, her book, The Right to Sex, she's a fantastic, accessible writer. So I don't think of myself as having that ability, but I did try to make it accessible to a wide general audience, in part because it's trying to address a actual sort of social, what I think of as a set of social and political and ethical problems in contemporary culture.
Yeah, very good. And I definitely feel that came across. I felt like it was pretty well written for that purpose. So yeah, so I feel like the first major question is, what are emotions, and specifically what are anger and shame? Early on, you're kind of skeptical note that you're skeptical of defining these merely in terms of like narrow phenomenal features or something like that, and prefer to think more broadly about maybe those features plus certain causal functional features or content and some other behavioral facts. Could you talk a bit more about this and why this is like important in the project?
Yeah, because it is quite important for my overall project, and actually it'll help maybe the audience to understand that I think if I'm right about the way I think about emotions, then the sort of analysis would be exportable to any emotion. So let me, that is, I talk about anger and shame primarily, but it technically would be exportable to any analysis of any emotion. So typically, well, there are several different theories in the psychology and philosophy of emotions. A familiar one to most people is what's called basic emotions theory. And that's an idea which my views are not incompatible with, but the idea there is something like this, that evolution equipped us with several different emotional dispositions. Some people call these affect programs, but they're basically the dispositions. They often involve facial expressions, but that humans come with some handful or a handful and a half of emotions, such as fear. What does fear do? Its functional role is you see the rattlesnake and you run for the hills. Surprise is also thought to be a basic emotion. That's just to signal that there's something new in the environment which requires our attention. Sadness, responses to death of loved ones, and so on and so forth, we're all familiar with. Disgust, contempt, and happiness. These are the ones that Paul Ekman, following up on Darwin in the 1870s in the expression of emotions in man and animals, Darwin thought that there were these emotions that were expressed facially. So right away, though, if you think about these emotions, you can see already that they're not just, as it were, distinguished by their phenomenal feel, like the feeling of sadness or the feeling of anger, but they're almost certainly designed to get us to do something. And the somethings they want to get us to do are actually two different things. One is what they want to motivate us to do, and by their facial expressions, which are a behavior associated with them, what they want to signal to others. So, back as the ice melts at the end of the Pleistocene, you and I are, hoarding as much as we can get some food and resources. And if you see me coming towards your resources, then the glare of anger might get me to back off before there's actual physical struggle. So many, many people from Darwin on have suggested that these emotions are for the sake of doing something. Now, you could analytically, of course, as we do, distinguish the part that is the feeling of the fear or the feeling of the anger. But they're definitely designed to play this functional role of getting us to do something. And again, a communicative role as well. Now, so this is a start to thinking about the emotions. I think is perfectly plausible to think this way. But one of the things that is a disadvantage of thinking of the emotions in this sort of basic biological way is it'll sometimes lead people to say things like that emotions are like reflexes. They're like a knee jerk to the doctor tapping on your knee or to pupil contractions to light. They just happen to you and there's nothing you can do about them. Even Descartes, in his Passions of the Soul, thinks in this direction because he says you can't help feeling the anger or the lust and so on, but you can sort of stop yourself from carrying it out. And you're actually only morally responsible for the carrying it out. You're not responsible for the emotion itself because that's reflexive. So when people think that way, though, it does lead to certain sort of folk psychological views about emotions, namely, it leads, or it has a relation to, I don't say it leads to, it has a relationship to this idea that people can't help but have the emotions that they have, or that they're entitled to the emotions that they have, or they can't be judged for the emotions that they have. There's nothing they can do about the emotions that they have. Now, that would be disturbing if I'm right, that emotions, though, have these sort of functional links always to behavior, because it will mean that it will be hard to control also emotional expression. So my view then becomes this idea that even though there's this package of basic emotions, in every culture we're taught both norms of what sort of proper things should be the proper causes of emotions. So parents teach children that this is nothing to cry about. You shouldn't be so sad that you have to share the Legos with your sister. So we regulate, we explain to children what are the proper causes of different emotions. We also do what Aristotle pointed out we do. We call upon people to regulate the intensity, sometimes down, sometimes upward. We say, you should be more upset about what she said to you than you are. But often we say to people, whoa, Troy, you're getting way too angry with me over this particular situation. And then, of course, there are what I call the norms and scripts for behavior. And those are highly culturally variable. So just to give an example I give in the book, and maybe we'll talk more about these later. Among American parents and German parents, children's anger is met with anger, and usually there's an escalation until someone wins, usually the parent. In other cultures, Japanese culture, the dominant style is that children's anger is met with what the behaviorists would have called extinction. Parents don't take it up. The idea being that will help the child learn that this is not going to get it anywhere in getting its what it wants satisfied. And that leads to cultural differences like this, that if you ask North Americans what they want to do when they feel angry, they will say they want to punch you. That's one of the top ones. But if you ask Japanese people what they want to do when they're angry, they'll say they want to leave the room. So in one case, it's an approach emotion. In the other case, it's somewhat of an avoidance emotion. And so why do I sort of encourage this view? Well, partly it's because it helps us see that in principle, at least, there are different ways that different cultures literally do the emotions. And therefore that emotions could be adjusted. I don't know if they can be adjusted for adults easily, but they can be, as it were, changed by social structure changes, by changes in norms and attitudes of parents, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, very good. So I guess like part of the key point there is that emotions they're not just these merely passive reactions or something like that. Like states we just happen to find ourselves in. They play or can play a major role in our social world on all sorts of levels, like personal, political, somewhere in the middle. And we can and do frequently exhibit emotions for various purposes. And a lot of your discussion here is meant to be drawing on, well, how are these used for various purposes in various cultures? And how could we learn from that? So like, and maybe could you talk a bit about what are some of the things you found? You mentioned an example there, but
Sure.
Some of the things you found in different cultures.
Yeah. So let me just say a little bit about the sort of background observations. So I've been thinking, and I've really been thinking this for the last 20 years probably, that I've never lived in angrier times. But I've been around for a while. I was a university student in the late 60s. I graduated from college in 1970. And those were angry times too. There was, of course, throughout the 60s in the United States in particular, the civil rights movement was was probably the dominant social movement of the time. There was the anti-Vietnam War movement. There was the rise of what some people call first wave feminism. There was the beginning of gay rights. Stonewall uprising in Greenwich Village was around that time, late 60s. So there was a huge amount of social change. I think that 1968, I always say, was the most transformative year I ever lived through. For a host of reasons. I mean, it was the birth control, came along. People say the sexual revolution is like 1967, 68. So these were times of lots of cultural conflict, but they were also more hopeful. And there was a lot of idealism involved. So what I started to observe is I just thought, we live in times where there's a lot of anger, but it's belligerent, it's often infantile, it's just nasty. It doesn't engage people. One doesn't use it as an opportunity to talk to other people. One uses it as an opportunity to put down people. But what I found as a philosopher, as I went around talking to people about this, what I perceived to be a problem, many people did say things like, well, that's just the way things are. That's the way it's natural to be angry given this situations. It's natural for people to behave this way. And that's where, Troy, I started to think about the way in which this emotions as something we're passive with respect to was causing trouble. And the view that emotions are just things that happen to us. And so that's what began me, on the sort of journey where I was looking at, because I knew around the same time, the last 20 years, I started to do more and more work in cross-cultural philosophy for a host of reasons. But I was very aware of the fact that there was a lot of variation in how people do the emotions, as I say. So, and I thought, well, what could be sort of therapy for these kind of views that emotions are things you're passive with respect to? One thing that could be therapy with respect to it would be to look at other traditions and see how they've conceptualized. In some cases, these are philosophical traditions. So back in the book before, How to Do Things with the Emotions, in the Geography of Morals, I did spend a lot of time there looking closely at two ancient ethical theories, Stoicism and Buddhism. So those are good examples of traditions which theorized starting a very long time ago. In the case of Buddhism, we're talking about theorizing about the problems of anger about 2,500 years ago, during what Jaspers called the axial age, the sort of time in which, you get Plato and Socrates, you get Confucianism, you get Taoism, you get Moism, and you get Buddhism and various views in the Indian subcontinent like that. And so, and then in the case of Stoicism, you're talking, about 2,000 years ago. So what's exciting there is one can go back and find particular texts, philosophical texts. So Seneca has this fantastic essay that I love to teach called De Ira, on anger. And he's directly challenging a view that he sees in Aristotle, and he's correct in seeing this in Aristotle. Many other scholars have discussed it, Martha Nussbaum very, very carefully and brilliantly. Aristotle, like many things, Aristotle authorized anger as a perfectly legitimate moral emotion to have if people treat you with disrespect, we would say, or spite, or something like that. If they try to downgrade you, and Aristotle says of at least one kind of anger, what he called orga, that if a person treats you with disrespect, then you're perfectly entitled to pay them back immediately by hurting them somehow, revenge. And so Nussbaum calls this payback anger, and I use her locution. Seneca comes along and says, well, we Stoics notice the following. Aristotle assumes that anger can be moderated or tamed. but we just don't see it. Seneca says, anger always gets involved in what's in the outskirts of the case. And I take it he means something like this, which might be familiar to all of us. At least I'll just speak for myself. In the history of my getting angry at friends and loved ones in interpersonal situations, I've sometimes said things about them or their behavior which I regret, which wasn't what the anger was about. You know, I can't think of an instance off the top of my head of where I've done this, but you know, the idea would be you and I are arguing, we're roommates. I say I'm sick and tired of you not putting away the dishes, something like that, and then you get heated back, and before we know it, we're saying nasty things about each other's eyeglasses or haircut or what we did 10 years ago. The things that are in the outskirts. So Seneca was skeptical about this. He was actually even skeptical about getting armies angry. He thought that, you know, angry armies rape and pillage, stoic armies just win battles. So it's a nice text in terms of, but the main philosophical point that Seneca made is that Aristotle says, well, all the Plato and Aristotle, ethics aims at the good. But if I aim to hurt you, I'm doing something bad. I'm harming you. And so there's almost a performative inconsistency in, on the one hand, saying ethics should always improve the other and trying to hurt the other. Buddhism, meanwhile, very interesting sort of discussions of anger. The Buddhists focus on the fact that a lot of our anger, in any case, a lot, maybe not all of it, is due to us not getting what we want. It's the ego sort of desiring that things be different and whining and complaining. You know, and I think you see this sometimes. Like a few years ago, I was at another university in North Carolina, and they have a Starbucks on campus. And I was sitting in a place having a cup of coffee and doing a little reading. And there was a long line between classes of students at the Starbucks. And I started to see this woman who I could see across from me start to huff and puff about the length of the line and how long she was waiting. And it sort of just caught my eye, and I watched her as she moved up. And, you know, and then was being very visibly upset. And then when she got through the line, she came over to her friends who were seated next to me. And she basically said, I can't believe how fucking long I had to wait. It was the worst, you know, it was like the worst experience of her life, like someone died. And then her friends consoled her and hugged her and things like that. Well, both Stoics and Buddhists would say that is just extraordinary, like self-indulgence. In the Stoic case, they would say, you should study astronomy to get a better perspective on, like, you know, that you are not the thing that the universe is aiming all its energies at. And sometimes you just have to wait in lines. And the Stoics would say, in those cases, you know, say something to yourself, like be indifferent to indifferent things. Anyway, meanwhile, the Buddhists say the same thing. You're just, if you can't, you know, cope with standing in lines, given that many people have coped without having food, clothing, and shelter most days of their life, there's something wrong with you, and you need to adjust your demandingness. So Buddhists also, besides the Stoics, have a long tradition of being really worried about the disruptiveness of anger and the way it can divide people and cause communities to fall apart. So those are two philosophical traditions that have a lot to say, and I've written quite a bit about those. What I did recently, to answer your question about, was a few years ago, I spent a year on leave at Stanford, and I pretty much read everything I could find in the cultural psychology and anthropology of anger. And what one finds when one looks there is you find, well, first of all, as you can imagine, a lot of cultures that were influenced by Buddhism, and in many cases, other Indian religions like various forms of Hinduism and Jainism, they all have these virtues, like ahimsa is a virtue of peace of nonviolence in Hinduism. that Gandhi made a lot out of. And Buddhism, of course, is a religion which theorizes anger as a problem, as is Jainism. So in any traditions influenced by those threads, you tend to have the view, and it's widespread in the culture, that anger is a very, very dangerous emotion. You should either pretty much eliminate it if you can, and if you can't do that, you really got to keep a close eye on it. So it's quite discouraged in lots of cultures. It's pretty prized in countries in the North Atlantic. So just to give one other example, and then I'll shut up and let you get another question in. Jeannie Tsai, who's a psychologist at Stanford, has done these really interesting studies where she looks at the top selling children's books on Amazon. Now, children's books are interesting because grandparents are the primary purchasers of them, and not surprisingly. But she looks at the emotions, the ideal emotions that are represented in Taipei, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, various places in North America. And what she finds consistently is that emotions prized in the North Atlantic are what she calls high arousal, positive emotions, like a really happy state, very excited state. And also that in North American children's books, anger is modeled as an appropriate emotion to have if you're frustrated. Whereas in Hong Kong and Taipei, serene, low arousal, positive faces are modeled as appropriate emotional states, and anger is never modeled as an appropriate response for children.
Yeah, a lot of interesting points. And then with respect to anger, you distinguish a few different sorts, but like two that you focus on and are critical of, or at least the use of, are what you call, as you said, revenge or payback anger, and pain, and the other one is pain passing anger. And those, you're kind of critical of them or the use of them, I guess, unless they're instrumental to some other good or something. Yeah, I mean, I guess, could you talk a bit about the sorts of anger and why, at least in certain cultures, you think they're overused or misused?
So, you know, my observations that I sort of trust are about, you know, the America that I live in now. That's but there's some confirmation from people I talk to that they agree that they've never lived in angrier times if they were around as long as I have been. So in any case, so most of what I have to say in terms of the lessons to be applied from other cultures is not, of course, that we should be like them, but that we can get some help in thinking about things. So you're absolutely right. So what I do, the first thing I do is, and I take this idea of spheres of anger largely from Martha Nussbaum, and I think it's just a really helpful template. So what she does is she distinguishes anger in three spheres, and I think this is plausible. You know, one sphere is anger in interpersonal relations with friends and loved ones, family, friends, and, you know, loved ones. The other is what she calls the middle realm, I think she calls it. That would be, you know, in sort of business relations, the way we treat people at the supermarket, the way supermarket people treat us customers, our local barista, bartenders, restaurant workers, cable TV companies, et cetera, et cetera. People who you don't have personal relationships with, but we know both customers can get mad at the people who are in the service industries, and service people can get very mad at customers. And that's a zone of life in which there can be problems. And then the third one is the political sphere. I think in all three spheres, we could do some, so first do some work. So analytically, that's sort of the sphere part. The part that you asked about, though, is the part in which I distinguish varieties or types of anger itself. And so, yes, and I think I have somewhere about 7 different kinds, but for purposes of today, let's just start with the 2 that I'm most worried about. So the one that I'm most worried about, and that other people have also, I mean, a lot of people have criticized this kind, is simple payback anger, where someone hurts you and you hurt them right back. And that is the kind that it looks like Aristotle authorized. Martha Nussbaum, in her great work on this topic, she thinks it's part of the concept of anger as we've sort of developed it, that payback is part of how we think of anger, or what we think of anger is for. I wouldn't go that far. I don't know if it is or isn't. In any case, but there's certain. But Aristotle is sort of the locus classicus of the observation that this type of anger exists, and he, in some sense, thinks it's okay. There I kind of side with the Stoics and the Buddhists for reasons I said. I mean, I wouldn't want to make a general, universal prohibition against it. I just don't think that most people feel good about themselves when the only aim of their anger is just to hurt back the person who hurt them. So it has that sort of, doesn't seem to abide fully norms that we have about treating the other as you would like to treat them as yourself, that are available in many religious traditions. And it also, as the Stoics pointed out, looks like it's in tension with the ends of ethics that even the Greeks, the lineage that is a series of footnotes to Plato, gave us. So that's one kind. I think it's very, very common, and I think people should just watch it because it makes the world a more and more unpleasant place, especially, your generation is much more aware of this than I am, but when I was a little boy, I was taught restraint of tongue and pen. It's kind of quaint when you think about it. And the idea was that if you literally think about it, if you and I have a dispute about something and we're mad at each other, well, when I was growing up, first of all, if we were going to have an argument over it, we would have to make a long distance phone call with each other because you live in Ottawa and I lived in New York. That was very expensive. So we couldn't do that. So the thing I would have to do is go find a piece of stationery, an envelope, write it, get to the post office, buy a stamp, and mail it. Okay, now you can see how this is going to work. If I restrain my pen, first of all, I have to do a bunch of things before I can respond. And that time out serves a very good function. Namely, it stops my immediate reactivity. Now with social media, one of the major places I see this kind of vengeful and cruel, quick reaction, often cowardly, because people often say nasty things about people that would hurt them were they to hear them. And they do expect them to hear about them, but they wouldn't say them to their face. In any case, that's payback anger. Pain passing anger, I think, has been under-theorized so far by philosophers who are writing about anger. It comes from, it's related to the idea that we started with about emotions being sort of reflexes, and that everybody will just have whatever emotions they have, and you can't blame them for having the emotions they have. It would be like blaming them for the nose they have, or the eye color they have, or the amount of hair that they have. There is that view. Now, it's in tension, though, with the view that an adult said to another adult, do have some control over how you experience your emotions. And again, other cultural traditions are really good at this. So Chinese philosophy, it's just standard for Chinese philosophers to talk about self-cultivation, that right from the get-go, you have to work on yourself and improve yourself. And that involves improving your dispositions to respond. So we all, as it were, work out the selfish child in us, and then eventually learn that cooperating with other children with the Legos is its own reward, is very satisfying, and so on. We go from being a person who wants to hoard wants to hoard the Legos, to a person who enjoys the rewards of sharing it. So that's both socialization and self-cultivation. Again, Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness a lot, and that would be another way to engage with yourself in your own development of emotional maturity. Now, pain passing anger is the kind of anger where I feel pain of some sort, maybe just because I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm sad, but I feel pissy. And I then express my pissiness to my family, to my coworkers, or whatever. And it's not because they caused the pain I'm in, but they are, as it were, available for me to spread the pain I'm in, possibly by showing an irritable side. A good psychologist back in the 80s called this the ventilationist view. The idea is that because we have permission to feel the way we feel, we also have a certain amount of permission, because otherwise we would become neurotic or something like that, to express our bad feelings to other people. And I think this is kind of infantile and kind of excessively permissive, and that people just should not do that. They should learn not to do that. So those are the two kinds that I worry about. The other kinds, of course, just to say a brief bit about them, there's another kind of anger which can look like pain passing anger, but is not. I call that recognition respect anger. So that's where you treat me as deplorable or unworthy because of, and it could be that you treat me as unworthy because of my race or my gender or my sexual preference or whatever. That, if I get angry back to you to demand that you treat me with recognition, respect, acknowledge my dignity as a human being, my aim is not to pass pain to you, although it might pass some pain to you. My aim is to get you to recognize the dignity and respect of a fellow human being. And that involves, as it were, improving you. And then, of course, there's political, sort of what we might call righteous anger, which is aimed at racist or sexist, for example, social practices. And I think those are, of course, very legitimate kinds of anger. But again, one could watch out for desires for revenge infiltrating even those things. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. And that's one of those cases where I think you talk about this somewhat, although not really in depth, where we can exhibit anger for some purpose like that. And perhaps it might even cause pain in others in some way. And that you can talk about sort of maybe double effect there if it's predictable and so on. But that's not the intended outcome. Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk a bit about that and how it might be instrumental? Yeah.
Right, good. Yeah, you need something like a doctrine of double effect here for cases that, because an obvious response to, you just might say something like this. Look at, okay, you treat me, suppose Troy treats me, suppose you say something about my being an old person. So you say something ageist. Okay. So now I can do one of two things. I can zap you right back. I don't know what I would say exactly. I'm not clever enough to think of it off the top of my head, but I just might say something to hurt you. Okay. Now, if my only intention is just to hurt you back, I've engaged in payback or revenge anger. And I have no greater purpose than just hurting you because you hurt me. Now, another possibility, though, is if you and all the other youngsters, if we elders start to notice that you're being ageist all the time, or just you individually are being ageist, I just might well just think, look, it's too bad that, I'm going to elaborate a thought process that probably wouldn't occur in this elaborate way, but I might just notice and have even thought about it a little bit. it's too bad the youngsters here don't have the same respect for at least some of the wisdom that we elders have, because we've been around for a while. And you know something about, say, Confucian cultures that respect the elders more. And I just want to sort of bring you back, you and your other young people back, to acknowledging that that's just putting down old people because of their age is just not a good thing to do. I want to do it to improve you, but I know it will hurt you. In fact, I might even actually say many of the same things I would say in the revenge case, sort of just, I might. But the aim or intention would be different in both cases. So the view that I have, I mean, I don't want to plug it into any particular category, but it's not purely consequentialist. It involves what the angry person's intentions are in carrying out the anger. So I've got to accept that there'll be a price. I will hurt you a little, but it will be both for your greater good and the greater good overall, that I hurt you a little bit if I can bring your attention to the proper norms. The same thing will occur in, say, Black Lives Matter activism. So, for example, I go to Maine for half the year every year. I happen to be up there right after George Floyd. I happened to be up there during the time that George Floyd was killed, and there happened to be a demonstration that I went to at the Bangor airport when Donald Trump was coming to Bangor. Now, you could, Black Lives Matter activism hurts the feelings of some people who think all lives matter. Some people who are racist, but some people who are also not racist, but just hurts their feelings. But one might say, if you do it with the right intentions, hurting their feelings is just the price that you're willing to pay in a complicated world for proper social change. But it better not be your primary aim to hurt the people, hurt other people. That's the idea.
Yeah. And you talked about how this is one of the angriest times, and you talk about some of the cases there. And how, it's a very difficult question, but how might we better deal with that, I guess, and especially particular if you want to make certain recommendations for how to use our anger, but we're already like embedded in a culture with existing norms and practices for using anger that's like very different. Like, what do we do? Are we trying to individually, or?
Right. No, thank you for that question. It's a really important one, and here's where you just put it very, very well. Okay. It's one thing for a philosopher to come along and say, guess what? If you think anger is causing trouble, there actually are models of other cultures, even contemporary ones, which don't have the same problems or don't do it the same way you do. Okay, so what I've done is, only thing I've done then is provide the possibility proof that a culture didn't need to evolve the emotional regulation, the norms and scripts for doing various emotions in the same way. That's all I've shown at this point. Now, then the next step would be, well, you say, well, what I can't become I can't become like that culture. We're not going to become Tibetan Buddhists or something like that. And I think that's right. All I can think of is that a philosopher writing about this and observing it, all it does is have there are 8 billion people on Earth. The same way in which if someone thought that the universe should make the line shorter or the traffic less for them, I can't think that this has a huge effect. It would take social work. It would take structural changes. However, that said, there is one area where a lot of people, I think, are starting to talk about it, with respect to the norms that people, the way people behave in social media, the kind of nastiness that can occur, the kind of immediate. I mean, there's some really interesting work, like Michael Lynch, an epistemologist at UConn, did a book called The Internet of Us. And he talks about how, you know, if people give a thumbs up or whatever, they give a smiley face to a headline in an article, that increases by like a lot. I don't know how much, I forget, the way in which other people will take it up, and everybody will feel like they're supposed to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to things. Now, one idea is that, and this would be epistemic improvement that would help with the ethical problems, maybe it should be that all children should be taught at an early age to investigate before they offer their opinion about anything that comes in like a headline or a haiku form. Like, you actually do research. Who wants to know what you think about a headline, really? And why does it matter? And so one could, I sometimes think one could start to think about practices that would be introduced to young people if we think that things are getting bad enough that would change social practices in the next generation. My example of this would be things like, there were people in my parents' generation, in my lineage, who were raised to be anti-Black racists. But they tried their very best not to convey it to their children because they knew it was wrong, even if they couldn't act as if always it was wrong. And I think sometimes generational change can come by those small transformations. But this is the question, that you asked me, is so far out of my capacity as a philosopher who's spent my career at institutions of higher education and, speaks to only a small part of the world, but hopefully makes a little contribution to the social change it would take.
Yeah, for sure. I can understand that. So just to remind people, I'm with Owen Flanagan here. We're talking about his book, How to Do Things with Emotions, The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures. I'll include some links to Amazon, and I think it's Princeton University Press in the description. So I did want to take a little bit of a step back, because you are sensitive, as you've kind of been saying, to the facts that different cultures or groups tend to have different emotions, use the emotions differently, and also in a way like carve up the space of the relevant mental, moral, and social phenomena in different ways. So like we might draw certain distinctions between like shame and guilt, for example, that others don't, or they don't, they're using it in a somewhat different way, or they might just not have terms for those same sort of mental phenomena, or they might not even experience the same sort of mental phenomena. And you also want to avoid generalizing conclusions drawn from studies in like America or other weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. More generally, I mean, with these difficulties in mind and some others that you talk about, I mean, how do we, it's kind of a methodological concern, like how do we even go about drawing substantive and general conclusions about like emotions cross-culturally? Is cross-cultural psychology fairly underdeveloped, or how do we?
Yeah, really great question. Really great question. Yeah, so yes, there's well, as you point out, I mean, I can't emphasize enough, and I've been doing it in my last two books, but I was really thrilled when finally in 2010, Joe Henrich and colleagues wrote this paper on the weirdest people in the world. because of the fact that I always have been working with psychologists, neuroscientists, and then lately with anthropologists and cultural psychologists. If you hang around in those rooms, you would have been where psychologists were always saying, gosh, we better hope that humans in general, that college sophomores in North America are representative of humans in general, because that's where most psychological inferences about human nature come from. And what Henrik et al. Did in that paper was they first of all asked the question, how much psychology is based upon North American samples? And at that time, at least in a certain set of journals, top journals mostly, the answer was over 90% are based on North American 18-year-olds. Then they asked the second question, because Joe is really a anthropologist or cultural psychologist. Then they asked the second question, how representative are people like us in general? And the answer was, we're the least representative group of people in the history of humankind. We're Western, we're educated, literacy is only 5,000 years old. We're industrialized, a couple hundred years old. We're rich, recent, democratic, a couple hundred years old, and so on. So weird people are very unrepresentative. What that makes me want to say is that we should just stop treating any psychological results as informative about humans in general. I take what we should just do is read information from psychology experiments as only about the people that are represented by the population tested. And a psychologist will complain about that because they'll say, well, no, it must be better than that. Well, we don't know it's better than that. And so that's number one. But number two is your question about how do you proceed to do this thing called cultural psychology in the domain, let's just talk about the domain of the emotions, given what I say about the degree to which emotions are socially or culturally constructed. And there, the answer is really carefully, and while being very, very careful about generalizations. So, because, here's just a really important point that shows you that semantics is not pedantic. Even the words we use, like happy, like say you want to study happiness. I'm doing some work on some of the research on happiness, and it's kind of a mess. And one of the reasons it's a mess is because what different people mean by happy, or the word that we would translate as happy in different cultures, is highly variable. So for example, when people are studying the word happy or the emotion of happy in America right now, many people say happy just means okay. Like if I say, Troy, are you happy? You say, yeah. You just mean you're okay. Now, that may not be 100% general, but in other cultures, it doesn't mean okay. It means something better than okay, and something different from okay. And the same thing will be true about words that we use for any emotion. So even in Seneca, he talks about the fact that, I think he says this, I think he compliments the Greeks for having like twice as many emotion words as the Romans have. Or maybe it was vice versa. Anyway, the point is that some cultures make lots of distinctions that are kind of, are very precise, and other cultures and their folk psychologies don't. So, here's a question. Is irritability or being irritated a kind of anger, or is it a precursor of anger? Is it being annoyed an emotion in its own right, or is it a kind of anger? And so on and so forth. So the first problem that psychologists have as they try to go cross-cultural is even in lining up the emotions in different languages. There's also the following fact that cultural psychologists find. In some cultures, some emotions are what they call hypercognized. Like, for example, in cultures that think about or think that anger is a very bad emotion, for example, they usually have elaborate ethno-theories about why it's a bad emotion. Like, for example, I mean, we even have an ethno-theory about it. So, for example, if you ask Americans why is anger bad, they usually will tell you something about its bad physiological effects. They say, oh my God, it gives me high blood pressure. If I'm angry, it gives me high blood pressure. If you ask people in East Asia about why anger is bad, they'll say it causes people to get in disputes and fall apart in their relationships. Is there a psychosocial effect? So, and then in other cultures, people have almost nothing to say about emotion words that they use. So, so you've just identified a major difficulty in making in doing cross-cultural study of the emotions. That said, the smart people who do this work are pretty good about putting out all the warnings and the caveats, and they might end up having to say something like, look, at what I'm studying as love in the South Pacific Islands, Caroline Islands, is in the vicinity of what we would call romantic love, but it has different characteristics. So the people who are doing this work, I mentioned Batya Mesquita, whose work I discuss a lot in my book. She's outstanding at this. Jeannie Tsai at Stanford is outstanding at this work. Hazel Marcus also at Stanford. Richard Schwader at Chicago. There are some really excellent thinkers who do really, really good work cross-culturally.
Yeah, for sure. And so just to kind of summarize, and I think you more or less said this already, but your main concern then regarding anger is, well, that thought that ethics should be concerned with trying to do the good, pay back anger and pain passing anger, unless it's sort of like the byproduct of something else, which is aimed at the good. That runs counter to that, and so it should be avoided. And that's, broadly speaking, that's your main concern with these sorts of anger, at least.
That's right. And I think that if we got our handles on those, like therapy on ourselves and social work on ourselves, that I think you might be surprised about how much that lowered the feelings that people have that this is an angry world we live in. I think it could do a lot of work of returning us to an atmosphere, social and political and interpersonal atmosphere that is healthier. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. And so while you say that anger is overused, at least in certain cultures, shame, on the other hand, is underused. And shame can be seen as something really negative, as an emotion that we shouldn't feel or perhaps shouldn't exhibit. And you contend that this view kind of misses out on some of the potential benefits of a more mature sense of shame. How would you describe broadly what shame is and how it might be more useful to us?
Right. So the background to this, this sort of the focus on shame in the second part of the book. Why did I pick shame? Well, again, I'm not as confident about, I mean, my diagnosis, I'm pretty confident about my diagnosis that the world is extremely angry right now. North America is extremely angry. It'd be better if we were less angry. And what contribution can I make to that? Well, I can make a lot of distinctions among kinds of anger, and I can tell you something about the way other cultures do it, and some of them look healthier than the way we do it. I came upon the shame interest a little bit differently, again, because of my work trying to, battle against what Alistair McIntyre calls the problem of being imprisoned by our own upbringing, and using philosophy of other cultures as a resource to think about things. I've been noticing, again, for the last 20 years since I made my move over towards cross-cultural philosophy of mind, ethics, that I was observing out of the corner of my eye that whereas we have in cultures that I grew up in, think of shame as a very negative emotion because it usually involves hating your whole self. And in hating your whole self, that will lead you to addiction, eating disorders, suicide attempts, and so on. I was quite aware of that. You just can't be a member of our culture and miss out that that's the sort of general view of shame. But I was aware of the fact as I studied more and more about Indian and East Asian philosophies that they didn't think about shame at all that way. And of course, Bernard Williams, in his great book, Shame and Necessity, he also points out the work in which the concept of shame did in Greek morality. So already I was sort of watching like what's going on here that these other philosophical traditions focus on shame so much and think it can do so much work, and we're so down on it. So again, because I tend to not only read philosophy, but I read what the psychologists say, I started to notice that this bad rap was unwarranted. At the very same time, I started to notice people in government in America, like Donald Trump, who didn't invent this type, but there was increasingly this type of person who were what we might call shameless. They just didn't respond to sort of ordinary norms of everything from decorous behavior or proper etiquette, including not being cruel to other people. But they didn't seem to be bothered at all by, for example, having just no respect whatsoever for speaking truthfully. And the question was like, what's going on here? And I noticed in journalism, one saw more and more expressions of shamefulness. Just last week, actually, since you're in Canada, I saw that Pope Francis, he apologized for these Indian schools, native original people orphanages. I think they were kind of like they took in native children, and many of them were sexually abused. They didn't. Some of them starved, and there were terrible things that happened. And Pope Francis, on behalf of the Catholic Church, because these were many run by the Catholic Church, said he felt ashamed. And I think that's a good example of a use of shame of the sort that I think is perfectly appropriate. Namely, what's Francis saying? Well, he's saying that I am part of I didn't do it, but I am part of the institution. In fact, I'm the major representative of the institution, the Roman Catholic Church, that did these horrendous things. And in virtue of my being a member of that group, I feel ashamed of that. Francis wasn't saying I'm a worthless human being. He didn't say that about himself. And so what I started to think was that shame is a perfectly reasonable emotion to have. Now, how is it distinguished, though, from other emotions? What even is it? Well, this is a puzzling situation. So most Americans will say, and I think this is true of Canada too, most Americans will say shame is a terrible emotion to have because it has all these downstream effects. But most Americans use the words guilt and shame synonymously. They don't have much trouble. They're not good at distinguishing between them. Now, the best way of distinguishing them, though, that I've come across is something like this. Bad things that you do are things that you should feel guilty about. So if you took the last cookie in the cookie jar and your mother had told you not to do it, you should feel bad about that action. If you hit your sister, you should feel guilty about that action. Shame, so guilt is associated with the bad actions. Shame is more associated with the, you might say, character trait or disposition that led to it. So when a parent instructs a child to share with the M&Ms with her sister or to share the toys with the other children, and says to the child who doesn't, you should be ashamed of yourself, she's actually, although not being very explicit about this, calling upon the child to work on a disposition in herself that will eventually make her like to share with other people. And you might say, in the cookie jar case, the mother could also say, you should feel ashamed of yourself. I told you not to take the last cookie. And that again means that you should work on the disposition that you have. What I then noticed was that if I think about shame in normal ecologies, it never means you should hate the whole person that you are, which is the standard meaning as used in North American psychology. So, for example, the standard test to distinguish between guilt-prone people and shame-prone people goes like this. If Troy goes into the Spanish vocabulary examination not having studied for 1 minute and bombs it, what does he think? Now, one thing he could think is, I should have studied. That is defined as the guilt response. If Troy thinks, I'm a worthless piece of shit human being, that's the shame response. Now, the shame response as defined that way or tested that way is ridiculous. No one should ever have that response, and it does involve a holistic judgment of yourself as worthless. But ordinary shame just doesn't work that way. And in every other cultural tradition I've studied now carefully, they never think of shame as something involving your entire person, or not typically. That's a very, very rare and unusual and not usually authorized kind of shame. So that was my first sort of entry into this idea that the bad rap of shame it's a complicated history, and your audience doesn't want to hear the whole history, but that's the way it sort of played out. And it's not surprising, by the way, when you think, if you define shame in that extreme way, that shame as a total derogatory attitude towards one's entire being would cause addiction, suicide attempts, and mental illness of all kinds of sorts, eating disorders. But most shame isn't like that. Most shame isn't like that.
Yeah. And you talk about how a more developed or mature or useful purpose of shame would be something largely internal, and its purpose to serve various values and ideals, self-correct when we fail to live according to them, and so on, and develop the dispositions and character traits that would serve them. That's kind of broadly how you're thinking about how shame might be used.
My idea, so one idea, and this is the most speculative idea in the book, maybe for that reason I like it the most, is, so going back to anger for a minute, Alan Gibbard, in his great book, Wise Choices, Apt Feelings, says our morality, I think he means North American morality, is, he says, an anger guilt morality. I'm allowed to get angry at bad things that other people do. So that's the interpersonal part. Anger is a guiding emotion there. I know someone did wrong if I'm disposed to feel angry towards them. And then he says, in the case of myself doing something wrong, it's a guilt morality, where he defines, or suggests, I should say, I don't know if he defines it, he suggests that guilt is anger turned inward. Now that's interesting, because that would mean that we're so good at anger, maybe too good at anger in the West, because it's either external anger or internal anger is what we use to regulate norms and ideals. Now, my idea is that where does the guilt system come from? And here I follow like people like Kant and Nietzsche. Well, the guilt system is, in some sense, a vertical system where I am supposed to feel guilty, that is, angry at myself, if I violate by behavior some norm that God has justified. And it might be good. It's sort of like, conscience, as traditionally defined, runs on guilt. And it might function well among people who either believe in such a vertical system of where God justifies the morality, and then our job is to abide it. And if we're good, at the end, we get to go to the nice place. What do we do in a world where there are huge theological differences among people. The gods are different, but also in which actually increasingly people are none of the above religiously. They're not actually no longer, in the North Atlantic, especially in the Scandinavian countries, Canada is way out there. America is becoming more so. When people are asked about their religion or their religious affiliation, they increasingly say, none, I'm not. Maybe people say they're spiritual, but not religious. So the question is, what in the 21st and into the 22nd and onward centuries will bind people together? And I think it will be an increasing acceptance of the fact that certain social norms are discovered over world historical time to be for the best. They would include things like that, for example, politicians are reconceive themselves in the way that they did conceive themselves in my youth as what were called public servants working for the common good. An idea like that could never come out of like Donald Trump's mind even. He just probably didn't even know that that was once said. Now, if you think that, then you also have norms like you ought to always to tell the truth to the people that you serve. And so the idea would be a good culture has basically widespread internalization of those social norms, not because they're grounded in theology or religion, but that they're grounded in a common understanding, an overlapping consensus, if you will, an unforced consensus, as Charles Taylor would call it, of norms and practices which all the people abide together. And that's what I call horizontal. So I think that shame is actually good for, some people will say, oh my God, even if you can defend shame, what it's terrible about is that shame is just about social consensus. And my view is you're kind of right, but think about social consensus on certain high ticket items as really important and involving the wisdom of the ages. So that's where I sort of think that shame could do us be a good emotion to start to get our head around as both in guiding your internal moral personality, but also as guiding interpersonal affairs, and therefore that you would feel ashamed if you violate certain principles. Although I'm not in favor, as you know, of shaming or humiliation. The reason I'm against those is because they end up looking just like pain passing, anger. They're just ways of being cruel to people.
Right, very good. And I was thinking on that, like primarily in the book, you're exploring, your certain first order normative questions, like what should we do with emotions, and then like a certain descriptive questions, like what do people do with emotions, what emotions are, and so on. However, you're not really primarily concerned with this underlying metaethical concerns, like that's not really the topic of the book. You said a couple of things there that might bear on that, but so I was thinking, like, well, this might have the advantage of remaining largely neutral on some controversial issues there. It does leave open some questions about what exactly it takes for something to be a good value, or something we ought to do with our emotions and so on. And then the epistemological question of how we determine what those good values and obligations are. How would you approach these questions? Do you think it's not really relevant to conclusions you draw, or?
Well, good. You read me exactly correctly as terms of what I'm doing in the book. I'm largely trying to avoid metaethical questions, although I do have a background, metaethic that of course, I do have one. And so what is it? Well, first of all, one thing that one might notice, and this is kind of being respectful of different traditions, at least different traditions say that they're grounding their morality in different things. We know that. Like some traditions will say, yeah, my metaethics involves a divine being, and these truths are grounded in either divine command or that we infer their existence from natural law. And then, of course, some philosophers will come along and say, well, they can't be doing that because there are no such things, and so on and so forth. So that's, of course, a whole sort of separate issue about sort of how to read other cultural traditions. I do tend to take a naturalistic view of moral judgments. I'm not a moral realist in the sense that I think that there aren't objective facts out there. I do think I'm more of a pragmatist, and I think my view would be similar. And I've talked to Alan Gibbard about this, Simon Blackburn too. They tend to be called non-cognitivists, Gibbard Simon is sometimes called a quasi-realist. Anyway, I've always thought that that the right way to interpret the difference between norm expressivism of the Gibbard Blackburn sort is it's a kind of cognitivism insofar as Gibbard explicitly talks about what he calls norm fact pairs. So again, you could think of this in terms of apt emotions of any sort. If you and I are hiking and I see the rattlesnake and I say, head for the hills, there's a rattlesnake. Well, it turns out to be someone's, a piece of string, the facts weren't conforming, but there's a good norm there. The norm is just get away from rattlesnakes fast. And you might just say, well, where does that come from? Well, it doesn't come from God for sure. We know that. It just comes from like sort of ordinary prudence. I think that morality, as we know it, is a complex set of, like I said earlier, discoveries that are made over world historical time. Some of them then are timeless because they just have to do with the ways humans standardly organize themselves. And they generally involve good practices. The ones we call moral ones are ones that have higher stakes than the ones we call conventional ones or etiquette ones. But even the ones we call etiquette ones are moralized in some cultures. So for example, in Kenyan households where 30 people eat together, then norms of not being a sloppy eater are moralized more than they would be if an American child is eating sloppily in his high chair. But I do have a broadly, I'm a philosophical naturalist, so that's going to come in if I were to have to sort of talk through the metaethics. But like you said, I'm preferring to stay. I'm not sure how much of a difference it would make to have to speak about metaethics to what I say at the first order level about anger and shame in this case, but it might.
Right, because I was kind of thinking that someone could have a very different metaethical view than you, but still agree with the conclusions you're drawing more or less.
Yeah,
at least for the practical purposes.
Yeah, that was what I was hoping. So I'm glad to hear you. Yeah.
Although my view is probably very similar to yours in those other regards. So yeah, I guess I did want to ask one other question about because you mentioned that the normal sort of evaluative object of shame is not typically the whole self or the whole person. And I was thinking about the self, sort of what the evaluative objects of our various emotions and attitudes are, and also what the subjects of them can be, in the sense that we talk not just about a attitude or emotion that a person has, but that, like, a group has, or something sub or super personal, if you want to put it that way. And in different cultures, people tend to think about their interactions and their emotions in different ways, and of the self in different ways. And I don't know, I guess not exactly sure what I wanted to ask, but I don't know, what did you find in terms of how different
It's very
cultures
helpful.
are thinking about these things?
Very helpful. Well, it goes back to what you asked when you were asking about how cross-cultural psychologists proceed. So back maybe in the 80s or 90s of the last century, there started to be some really great papers on Hazel Marcus with Kitayama, Japanese psychologist, started to look at the ways in which different people thought of we're inclined to use the language that you just used, the self, and it's good. So the standard view, this came out, I mean, this relates to a shame case, but it generalizes. So it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask an American, are you happy or are you satisfied? Or Canadian. And the answer is, as it were, about you. Now, I mean, of course, your family's well-being and suffering will have some effect on how happy you are. It will have an effect on it. But it's perfectly possible that you could be extremely happy, like a 10 on a ladder, and someone else in your family, a sibling, grandparents, are suffering in some way or other. So we can say things like, I'm very happy, but grandma's dying. That would be a thing one could say. What other people found in other cultures is that the unit of pleasant emotions and the unit of negative emotions, I just mean by hedonically negative, like feeling ashamed is negative, anger is negative, is larger than just the self. And this is, some people complain about shame cultures in this way, what are called shame cultures in this way. But I think it might be a different issue than just them using shame. But it happened in a recent event. I'm not sure the date here, but it feels like it was in the last 5 years. There was a ferry that had a lot of school children on it in Korea, and it sank, and a lot of children were killed. And immediately there were resignations, and I believe at least one hanging of a person who we would have thought of as not responsible at all for the children going down. Maybe it was the vice principal of the school. Now, we would treat, if a vice principal of a school in America hung himself or herself because the children drowned, we might understand it as a very unfortunate reaction that they had, probably because they were antecedently depressed or had a mental health problem. We would understand it, but we would have trouble thinking of it as having any coherent moral reason behind it. But there are cultures in which, and East Asian cultures show up this way, where one does have a greater sense of the interpenetration of the self with other selves in such a way that their weal and woe is in fact something that one is responsible for, and is open to feeling in ways that maybe in more individualistic countries were not. This is, of course, still being worked out in the anthropology and cross-cultural psychology of it, but it looks like a genuine finding about porousness of the self to other people, the ability to have. So, for example, here's an interesting fact, because of the work I'm doing on happiness right now. The government of Bhutan put into its constitution that it was concerned with the gross national happiness of its people. But in that constitution, it also says no Bhutanese person can be happy until everyone is. Now, that's obviously just completely normative, right? It would be very peculiar if we said Troy can't be happy until every Canadian is, or Owen can't be happy until every American is. That's just, so it's a completely different sort of stylistic of understanding emotions that could be missed if you're just thinking in terms of the way you think about the emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, some good insights there for sure. And Yeah, so I think we're nearing the end here. I did want to, normally at the end, I ask a question about what you think the value of philosophy is. Um, Maybe it's kind of a softball here, but just to kind of end it, what do you think is some of the importance and values of this sort of philosophy and psychology?
Well, here I come back to like this kind, I'll just say this kind, because, philosophy is so varied, as you certainly know, that I'm not sure of the, I would always be prepared to give the general defense that philosophy just is really helpful in teaching people to be critical thinkers and to make analytic distinctions where there are analytic distinctions necessary. And I always see when I read, because I hang around with people from other disciplines all the time, and I almost always think the only real value that I can add here is helping you make distinctions that you should be making that will be helpful to you in progressing. But with respect to my interest in, I started out, being really interested in sort of standard issues in philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem, free will determinism, what makes people tick. And, that has always led me to think, because I'm a naturalist, I've got to watch out what's going on in other disciplines. Early on, it was psychology and neuroscience, and now it's more cultural psychology and anthropology. But I really do think here that my old friend and teacher, Alistair McIntyre, I love that quote that I use pretty much a lot lately, where McIntyre says this. He says that we would never accept that you could be a philosopher of physics without knowing about physics. And we would never expect that you could be a philosopher of law without knowing about the law. But he laments that ethics often only requires knowledge of, at most, how trolleys operate, we'll say. He says, but McIntyre says, right, he says, but we don't expect the students who do ethics to study sociology or psychology or anthropology. And then he says that without this knowledge, we're not aware of the varieties of human possibility, and we're in danger of being imprisoned by our own upbringing. And I think that's the value of doing cross-cultural work.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that quite strongly. It's very good. I think that's a good place to end off. So yeah, thanks Owen for being here and taking my questions and providing your very thoughtful answers and for writing this book. It was a great read.
Thank you, Troy. You were a great interviewer, and great success to you in your philosophical career.